How's everyone doing? This doesn't have to be a quiet session. We're going to be a boisterous session, okay? We want amens, we want clapping, we want cheering. This is an incredible lineup we have, so we need to give them a lot of good energy. Hello to you at home. Hi, Mom. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Courtney Martin. I feel like storytelling is kind of like my religion in a sense. When I was 17 years old, I wrote this quotation. I wrote a bunch of quotations, some of which could not be said right now on the live stream because of curse words, but on the back of my closet door. And one of them was, which anyone who's ever received an email from me is going to roll their eyes right now because they've seen it ad nauseum. Engrave this upon your heart. There isn't anyone you couldn't love once you'd heard their story. It is by an obscure nun, Mary Lou Kaunaki. I have no idea where I found it when I was 17, but it has guided so much of my life. When I write op-eds, when I write books, when I collaborate with people like David, who you'll hear from soon, or my dear collaborator Vanessa in the audience, it's always about trying to figure out how can we make each other fall in love with someone we didn't know we could fall in love with. I think that's the basis of a lot of what needs to happen in the world right now. So you're going to hear some stories today that I hope make you fall in love with someone you didn't know you could fall in love with. I ask you to listen in two ways that I think are really important. One is great stories name something we know in our bones, but we've never had the ability to name. It's like something familiar that we feel, even if the person on the stage is totally unlike us demographically. So listen for the familiar, listen for the thing that nourishes you and makes you kind of lean in and go like, oh, that's me too, like I get that. And also listen for the thing that makes you uncomfortable, right? The best stories in the world destabilize us in a really good way. Piaget, who is a teacher and a thinker about how people learn, said that we should all be have optimal disequilibrium in order to learn. So where do you feel that disequilibrium and how can you grow into it, right? So where are you comfortable and nourished by this? Where are you uncomfortable and sort of off kilter in this? All of that is the really good stuff. And I hope your questions at the end will come from that place too. You're noticing about those two things. We are going to have 4 speakers. They're going to speak for 7 minutes each. We're going to give them a tremendous amount of love. And then we are going to all come back up, all of us, and I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then we're going to go to you to ask you a few, or have you ask them a few questions. So that's kind of our run of show. Does that all make sense to everyone? Sound good? Yeah. All right, so I got to get my official bios here. We are in for a very strong start. First up is Vivianne Ihekweazu, who has over 20 years of experience as a professional communicator and is the managing director of Nigeria Health, where she played a pivotal role in coordinating the COVID response in that country. She must be very tired, but she looks fabulous. Her Twitter bio says, which I loved, that she is an Afro-optimist who believes in the hope and opportunities on the African continent. Gotta love that. Please welcome to the stage, Vivianne.
Thank you, everybody, and it's a really pleasure for me to be here this afternoon. So I'll start my story. It didn't quite happen as I'd always imagined. I'd always thought that on the particular day, I would have candles, I would have music playing in the background. But on that particular day, I found myself lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by midwives, chattering in a corner, talking about how they had spent their Christmas day cooking with family, etc. You see, our first son was born on Boxing Day. Even that I never quite imagined it would happen. I'd always had this view that I would never have a Christmas baby. That was just not for me. You know, imagine having to plan a party and then Christmas at the same time. The poor child would be forced to share Christmas with share their birthday was a very important event in everybody's life. But that's even looking back now are some of those simplistic, almost frivolous thoughts you have as you're approaching the journey into motherhood. But anyway, it ended, and this was how I first experienced, for me, the joys of motherhood. So fast forward, And as I had imagined, this is what motherhood was, and this is the lens through which I had seen it. And as I started my story, I talked about the thoughts I had. Around the time also, many of my friends also were having babies. We shared the same stories about the first kick, etc. All of this changed about 10 years ago when I moved to Nigeria. Nigeria is a country with over 200 million people. And just in that 1 year, there were 8 million births. I'm talking about motherhood and that journey. And the image we have in our head is something like this often, of a mother and a child. Motherhood is that basic human connection, that emotion a mother has, the biological experience they have with their baby. So for me, this really was motherhood. But it changed, as I said, when I moved to Nigeria. With a population of over 200 million, sadly, Nigeria accounts for one of the highest shares of maternal mortality. For one maternal death, for every 200 live births. That is a very, very sad statistic. But I started off by talking to you about my experience, how I had always envisaged it. You see, the work we do at Nigeria Health Watch, the NGO that I run, we focus on health communications and advocacy, really amplifying a lot of the health issues that happen in Nigeria and holding policymakers and decision makers accountable. And part of that work took our team to a state in the south of Nigeria, Bayelsa. Now, Bayelsa is a riverine community on the Niger Delta. And in the process of doing our work, we met a young lady. Her name was Ebiladai. Now, Ebiladai was one of those women. She was 29 and pregnant and was a community champion. And she spoke to women about the importance of going to antenatal. And she shared stories which quite honestly surprised me and my team. Because you see, I had come with that lens of motherhood and the journey of pregnancy, which I'm sure many of you can probably share. But this is how that really changed and made me appreciate the power of stories. And some of the stories she told us are really founded in those social norms and assumptions that often disempower women. Things like, if you are a strong woman, you will give birth in the community. That is what your mother did. That is what your grandmother did. Things we had never quite imagined, but were true for them. Because that is the lens through which they were seeing motherhood. And for me, that journey was not what many of us had always imagined. But for many women, this is what they experienced. And her story was powerful in that she also shared with us that, if there's a negative outcome when a woman has a baby, there's always this burden of blame on that woman. There is no clinical explanation for it. And you also learn that a lot of their stories don't often get heard. So they go through that journey of pregnancy. Unlike, as I mentioned, when I had my friends to talk to, it was something they went through with fear. So she was somebody who really used her voice to ask those people who had the power to change that, provide better healthcare for the women. When they need to go to a health facility, provide them the support. Sadly, we learned that despite her advocacy, she was one of those statistics. And that's the work we do at Nigeria Health Watch. We use our platform to share those stories, those lived experiences of women. How do we create those platforms? That led us to create the Community Health Watch project, where we trained community reporters to work with these women. How can we elevate their voices? How can we create a platform where they can share their experience? And how can we use that as a platform to hold policymakers and decision makers accountable so that they get listened to? Because we often find that when these stories don't get heard, those lived experiences don't reach those, and nothing ends up happening. And those myths and narratives keep on being perpetuated. So for me and our team, amplifying and telling those stories was very important. And standing here in front of you, we have learned a lot, and I feel privileged and humbled in being able to use our platform to tell those stories, but beyond telling those stories, using them to elevate women's voices, How can we use that to change policies and practices that impact women? Because really, we know that some of these assumptions, and when women's voices are not heard, it impacts their outcomes. Like in America, a black woman is 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes and complications from childbirth than a white woman. It shouldn't matter your social economic circumstances, your income, your education. The story of every woman matters. And we need to create those platforms and have those discussions and really raise it as an issue that needs to be focused on and given better attention. And so for us as an organization, this is important. How do we collectively, individually and collectively, use our platforms to ensure that these stories get heard? Because the power of storytelling has the ability to change narratives. And for these women, when we created the platform for them to tell their stories, they were able to now share their experiences and views. And for me, this is my story. And this is the story that I wish for every woman. Thank you.
Do you want to sit there? Great. I told them I was going to make them stand up here for your applause and not let them get off the stage. So Vivianne was like, okay, I'm doing it. I believe, they are offering you the gift of this story, and you are offering them the gift of the applause. And so to have that reciprocation, they have to really take in how much that meant to you. That was so beautiful, Vivianne. Thank you. It made me think a bit about, the relationship between stories and mythology, story and myth, right? Like the idea that women were not strong enough to give birth in certain places and how damaging that is. So maybe that's something we can get into in the Q&A. Next up is my dear friend and collaborator, David Bornstein. When I was a baby journalist, I was probably like 27 years old. I was thinking about quitting journalism because I was really interested in writing stories about solutions, about people who are trying to respond to the worst, kind of crises of the day. And I kept getting rejected. And I thought, maybe I'm just not cut out for this. And David and I had a mutual friend, Marcy Alberher, who said, you two need to get together and talk. And I had read David's book, How to Change the World, so he was kind of a hero to me. And I was like, really? He would meet with me? And she said, yeah. So we met at a coffee shop. I remember it was in the West Village. It was like a sweaty summer day. And I said, yeah, I think I'm going to quit journalism because I'm clearly not interested in the right stuff. And he said, you are not broken. Journalism is broken. We need to create a field where we write and report as compellingly and rigorously about solutions as we do problems. The rest is kind of history. I'm now an old 43, which makes you really old, David. And I'm still a journalist, and we created the Solutions Journalism Network together along with our colleague Tina Rosenberg, and I'm just so grateful for everything you've brought into my life, David, and I know you'll bring into theirs. So here we go, David Bornstein, to the stage, please.
Thank you, Courtney. This is sort of a problem statement, so take a second to read the cartoon. Everything is horrible, worse than we ever imagined, and there's not a damn thing we can do about any of it, but whatever happens, we can't give in to despair. So I've been a journalist for 30 years, and I love journalism. I love turning the raw material of reality into stories that can help people understand and make sense of the world and lives and all that. But I've really worried, as Courtney was saying, that we were contributing a lot to despair over the years. The book that Courtney mentioned, How to Change the World, came out just before the very first Skoll World Forum. So I was here for forum number 1. And as a writer who came to be known as a writer about social innovation, I would come to this forum every year and I would get like 100 pitches. And I would go home and I started, at the pace that you write, this would be years of work every time I would come here. So I kept on thinking, like, how do we open this field up? And then I had this open up storytelling about social innovation in the field of journalism, so sort of unclog the arteries of journalism. So the stories of like people everywhere here in this room can flow all around the world, and you don't have to come to Oxford to have these kinds of exposures. You can get them every day in all of your feeds. And then I kind of had this pivotal moment when, after my mother passed away, my father, who lives in Montreal, I grew up in Montreal, he was really low, and I would call him every night at like 11 o'clock and just, how you doing, Dad? And one day he literally said to me, he said, Dave, I'm convinced that humans are worse than animals. And he had such a heaviness. And I was like, are you watching CNN, right? And he was watching CNN at that very moment, and that's what he would fall asleep to. And I got really angry, and that was and I remember calling up Tina, who I was writing this column with at the New York Times, and saying, we got to do something about this. And that was kind of how the idea of the Solutions Journalism Network was born, this way of like working with news organizations around the world to change the idea of what news is. And we track now solution journalism from close to 2,000 news organizations in our tracker. And this is really an opportunity now to remake the feedback system of the world so that it's much more helpful. And I want to just give two examples of stories that one I wrote, part of a column, in a column that I used to write in the New York Times called Fixes, which is a weekly solutions-oriented column. And another one is a story I just sort of keep in my heart when I feel susceptible to despair, which I think we all do at certain times. So this is a story called the headline, Teaching Children to Calm Themselves. I came across a statistic from a researcher that kind of alarmed me. It was that preschool expulsions, if you can like even hear that phrase, were 10 times more common in the United States than elementary school expulsions. In other words, kids at the age of 4 were being booted out of preschools because of behavior problems. And I remember thinking, like, looked into it, it's very much driven by child trauma, kids who are very dysregulated because of what happened to them, and the inability of the system to really even understand and deal with it. So I was thinking of writing an article about it, but talking to my editor, he said, no one's going to read this. It's too heavy. And so as we do in the sort of the solutions journalism mindset, we're like, the question is who's doing better against this? So I did some research, and I found that there were quite a number of programs, and I decided to focus on one in Kansas that was called Head Start Trauma Smart. And what they did when kids came in is they trained the educators and the bus drivers and the cafeteria workers to understand how to recognize a child who has experienced trauma, who had a high ACE score, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And instead of doing the normal things that they would do with these kids, which was, if not expel them, timeouts or sitting in the corner, facing the wall, or reprimanding them, or separating from the group. All these kids, if a child has trauma, they feel profoundly unsafe. So now you're separating from the group, you're asking them to sit in the corner, it just makes no sense at all. So what they learned is that the kids actually, what they need most, and they would train the educators around this, is they need attunement. They need an adult who can look at them and say, boy, you're so upset. I mean, a kid has just hit another kid over the head with a fire truck because the kid took his block, and then the teacher is looking at the child and saying, look how upset you are. I can see you're so upset. Look at your fists. Look how balled up they are. I don't think I've ever seen you this upset. Something must have really bothered you. And so the kid can relax a bit because attunement is vibrating at the same frequency as another person. It's not listening to them. It's not attention. It's a different quality of being. And that's very important. And this is all sort of supported in the research. And then the next thing a child needs is validation. So I would be upset too if someone took my block. That's not nice. You're not crazy for getting upset. You're normal. But we can't be hitting each other in Head Start because then no one will feel safe. So what are some of the problem-solving strategies we can come up with in order to help? And so you're talking to a 4-year-old, and the 4-year-old will have strategies. Can I go sit in the calm down corner on the beanbag chair and play with the bendy Gumby doll, or use the Velcro, or have a crunchy snack? I mean, these are all things that the calm down corners have, which are tactile, and they're very, very well designed to help children go from being hot, which is how little kids describe a traumatic response, my body feels hot, to being able to learn how to actually self-regulate themselves, or at least ask for the connection that they need from a safe adult. So 4-year-old kids were being trained, or not trained, but educated to take care of themselves. That's why the article was called Teaching Children to Calm Themselves. And the research showed that this was extraordinarily transformative, that in the 3,000 kids who were studied, kids were starting to have friends. They were starting to be able to sit still long enough to learn their ABCs. They weren't wetting the bed as much when they were home. Their grandmothers or their parents said they will now accept a hug. Really powerful changes. I mean, if you make that kind of change for a 4-year-old, you are changing the trajectory of a whole person's life, because that is just gonna, you can just see where that trajectory leads. So I wrote this story, and it was extraordinary to see the reaction that it had. First of all, it was the most emailed and most Facebook story in the New York Times for a week, which is crazy. Like, that never happens. And my editor said, we've never had a story on child trauma, like literally be that popular for, even close to that. And then I started hearing from the people who ran this program, and what they told me was that 4 years after this story came out, more than 200 organizations across the United States in 10 states were using this model, so that this approach had spread dramatically across the country and is actually now part of the child health program in New York City as well. So I never would have had that impact if I had just written about the problem of preschool expulsions. And at the same time, the knowledge that's now sort of moving around the system continues to ripple out. So that's really the approach, that why solutions journalism can be transformative, because it can draw attention to a serious issue, but at the same time dramatically increase the efficacy and what we call hope with teeth, which is rigorous hope. Hope that you can hold people accountable with, because better options are available. So this is kind of the questions that this is the sort of the question that I have that sort of dominates my life now, is what are the kinds of stories that the world needs in order to build the moral imagination, in order to be radically helpful to people who are suffering from mental health issues, from the environmental crisis, and so forth. And this is a really solvable problem. We have these communication systems that are built that reach every person in the world. We just have to be much more thoughtful about what we put on them, the kinds of stories that we tell, so that everyone in the world can have the kinds of thrilling exposures that we're all having here at this conference. And I'm going to tell this story later on, because I've run out of time. So thank you.
Thank you, David. First of all, did anyone in this room get not suspended, whatever the word was you used? Expelled from preschool?
Okay.
Are you nodding because you did? I'm like, we got to hear about that later. I want to hear some preschool suspension stories. Okay. Also, David, I feel like you need to do a follow-up story on the abuse of calm corners, because I have a 6-year-old, and many nights when we're sitting around the dinner table, I'll say, so what did everyone do in school today? And Stella, my 6-year-old, is like, just chilled in the peace corner. And I'm like, did you also learn some things? Or and she's like, well, it's just a chill day in the peace corner. So I'm afraid for some children, the calm corner has become, a place of abuse. Okay, so our next speaker, I don't think got suspended from preschool, although we could ask his mama, who he often invokes. He is the son of Baltimore. He is the CEO of Common Future. He said I'm not allowed to tell any embarrassing stories about him, so I'm going to abide by it. Please welcome to the stage, Rodney Foxworth.
Thank you for holding up that you're part of the bargain, Courtney.
I'll be a drink later.
All right. So I don't have any slides, but Vivianne's stories and the slides that you used, and David's, you actually will have opened up the imagination that I'm going to ask for you. So I want you to imagine 8-year-old me, okay? Now, 8-year-old me is very cute, very adorable, full of promise, right? And because I grew up in the 80s and 90s, my mother probably dressed me up in a terrible sweater. So I want you to imagine that. At the same time, I'm going to bring up 3 words that are oftentimes associated with black men and boys: lazy, unintelligent, violent. All right. Now, as I got older, I realized that those words weren't just described to black men and boys in the U.S., but across the globe. And so I'm going to ask another question, or I'm going to pose a question to you. Just by a show of hands, and don't be shy, just by a show of hands, I want to see how many people throughout their course of life have actually heard those words be ascribed to black men and boys. Yeah. Nearly everyone. And by the way, I wasn't trying to trick you. I wasn't trying to say you believe those things, but I wanted to see what kind of association in your own minds. So when you think about those words, and you ascribe them to an 8-year-old boy, that's the story I'm going to share with you, right? So when I was growing up in Baltimore, I was fortunate that my mother, as Courtney pointed out, I evoke her a lot, my mother decided to put me in pre-K and kindergarten into an Afrocentric program. So effectively what that meant was that all I understood at a very young age, and it was the very first and very limited amount of time I had experiencing this, was an understanding of black people that was the opposite of the words that I shared earlier, right? So I understood that I was consistently told stories, not myths, but stories, that really demonstrated that black people were caring, brilliant people. I understood stories about black men who were artists, writers, and inventors, right? That, for 2 brief years, that was effectively what I was surrounded by. And I believe my mother made that decision intentionally, as many mothers do, and mine in particular, because she understood that her black son was going to grow up in a world in which I would be surrounded by stories that would tell me that I was unintelligent, I was lazy, right? And when I think back to that, I think so much about how, even today, how that impacts me, right? How it gives a sense of not deserving something, being undeserving, that I shouldn't be on a stage like this. And how often you have to combat that, because I only had those 2 years, right? Now, I grew up in Baltimore, as I said earlier, went to public schools, and like every parent, my parents wanted to make sure I had the best education available. So unfortunately, I went away from the Afrocentric program because they only did 2 years. And I went to a school in which was regarded to be one of the better elementary schools. And it was great for the first few years. It was also the first time that I actually had white teachers, right? I had not seen or experienced white educators. And so my first few years, it was great, it was fine, quite studious. I was a hallway monitor, right? And I had that terrible orange belt. I would ask people, when they were going to the bathroom, do you have your hallway pass? I was that kid. I was on the chess team. I tried band. I did all the things that were, my mom wanted me to do, that she thought would grow my capacity for understanding and develop my talents. Having said that, and understanding the expectations that my mother had for me and my father, I should include my father in this as well, they wanted me to excel in school, right? They wanted me to be great. They wanted me to reach my potential. Because again, remember, at 8, I was very adorable, cute, and I was full of promise.
Still are.
Thanks, Courtney. Unfortunately, I had this one teacher who didn't believe any of that. She did not believe that I was as capable as my mother and father believed me to be. So she could not understand how it was that I was doing so well in my classes and those sorts of things. She actually accused me of cheating on my statewide tests that many of you maybe have had to have, and tried to hold me back in my grade. Said I could not read and that I cheated. Now, I was a shy kid. I didn't speak much in class. I just did the work. So, of course, my mother was not going to stand for that. She understood that this could not possibly be true. She forced me to read all the time, you know. I think she was reading to me in the womb and all those sorts of things. And so my mother took action, or organized some other parents. They actually discovered that this one teacher was doing this for many years, identifying black boys in her classroom, holding them back, sometimes getting them expelled. And so my mom organized these with other parents who realized this was happening, and then got that teacher dismissed. Right? Now, years later, reflecting upon this, trying to have some empathy, I think about what types of stories was this educator hearing, repeated to her, she was perpetuating for herself, in which she could take the 8 and 9-year-old black boys that she was responsible for teaching and identify them as problematic, unintelligent, incapable of doing the work. And how tremendously powerful is that? That stories can do that. And so I am thankful, however, that I've been able to consume stories that actually teach me that I can, as a black man, be an entrepreneur, a leader. That I've had enough stories in which I can better understand that I'm not a part of the problem, that we are part of the solution. And so the last thing I'll say is that stories can both transform, right, and undermine the very work that we're trying to do.
Yes. I think we should do an extra round of applause for Kim Foxworth, Rodney's mother, don't you? As a badass mama, you do not want to mess with her little boy. I love that story. It was so interesting to hear David and Rodney back to back, because I feel like both of them are talking about, in part, this notion that stories are a form of nourishment, right? And we can choose. Sometimes we can't choose, but we can in this room and online intentionally think about what is the diet of story that we are consuming, and how does that shape what we think is possible? How do we turn off things that shape us in ways, as that teacher was shaped, that are not life-giving? And how do we turn on things that are going to shape us in ways that are life-giving and broadening and, as I said in the beginning, that push us to be uncomfortable and change and like move this generational story that we're all a part of forward. So hoping we're all thinking about that as we're listening. Last but certainly not least, we have a vision in yellow. Anasa Troutman. Anasa is a, yes, already. This audience knows what y'all are in for. So she is a Renaissance woman, a music producer and creative director, a writer, a cultural strategist. She's a teacher who has worked with a lot of organizations here and all over the country on thinking about narrative change and justice and some of these things we're talking about up here. The list goes on and on. She's going to share a story that feels incredibly timely, given what we've all been hearing about Tennessee and the South in the last couple of weeks, and about sort of our ability to reimagine, the American South, but all of our lives. Please welcome to the stage Anasa Troutman.
Hey, y'all. Hi. I live in Memphis. I feel very at home in this room. Memphis was named after a city in Egypt, and we have a giant pyramid in Memphis. Unfortunately, inside of it is a, what do you call those fishing stores? Bass Pro Shop is in our, but whatever, we're gonna move past that. So I feel like y'all have been hearing a lot about my home over the past few months. We started out being one of the places that we immediately lost abortion rights. Then we have the murder of Tyree Nichols by 5 black police officers. Then we have the banning of drag shows in places where children are, which is mind-blowing. And then we had a mass shooting in Nashville, and now we have the Tennessee 3, no justice, no peace. And Memphis is also the biggest urban food desert in the entire United States. It is 65% black with a 40% poverty rate. 50% of all children are born into poverty. And still, it's the best place I've ever lived. It's the most hopeful I've ever felt. It's the most creative I've ever felt. And it's a place that has changed me fundamentally, and I'm very grateful for it. The first time I went into Memphis in my modern life, somebody was like, hey, I think you should go visit Clayborn Temple. And I am an adventurous woman, and with no invitation, I just bust into this construction site. Like, someone told me to come in here, and I just wanted to meet y'all, so hey. And I walked in the door of this building, and my brain exploded. And it felt like every ancestor in the entire city had showed up in the building, and I saw colors and lights and dancing. And I was like, what is this place? And they told me that this was the home of the Sanitation Workers Strike of 1968. So these men and their families in 1968 put on a series of conversations and marches and demands that was really one of the first recorded conversations at the intersection of race and class in the South. And it was the place where Dr. King saw the future of his movement, because he was also trying to have that conversation, and everybody was hating on him so bad. He was losing funders, he was losing friends, he was losing colleagues, and he was like, but Memphis though, if we can go and help them make this work in Memphis, then I can show everybody what's possible for America. Because he wanted us to have a race conversation, yes, but also have a conversation about class, and also have a conversation about militarism, and saying if we don't do all 3 of those things, we are not going to get free, not any of us. And so I attached myself to these folks, and I ended up executive producing and co-writing a musical about the Sanitation Workers Strike for MLK 50, which was the 50th anniversary of King's assassination, right? Which is wild, because like, I've done a lot of things in my life. I had never written a musical. And it was real, it was good, y'all. It was good, it was good. But the thing is, like when you're writing a musical that's a historical drama, you have to do research. And I learned about this man here, this tall man in the hat. His name is Robert Church. He was born an enslaved man. His father was also his owner and was also his commander in the Confederate Navy. Talk about a complicated relationship. And there is this wild story about how during the Civil War, the Union Navy was coming down the Mississippi River, and Robert Church was like, yo, I could either go down with this ship, or I could make a swim for it. And he jumps off this riverboat in the middle of the Mississippi River, swims for his life, makes it to the bank, gets on to the banks of the Mississippi River, and sets out to make his fortune. Now, it's a very complex and convoluted story that I'll tell you another time when I don't have 7 minutes. But ultimately, Robert Church became the first black millionaire in America. He had a real estate fortune. He owned and developed most of downtown Memphis. He was, anybody know Ida B. Wells? He was Ida B. Wells' patron. He was W.C. Handy's patron, who was the father of the blues, and he was the person who built Beale Street. He actually saved Memphis because during the yellow fever epidemic, all the white people who could afford to leave left, and everybody else died. So Memphis lost its charter because it had no tax base, it had no people, there was no one there who had any money at all. And the only reason why Memphis exists today is because Robert Church bought the first ever municipal bond in Memphis and saved the city. So everything you know about Memphis, from the civil rights history to the cultural history to the fact that it exists in the first place, is because of this man. Well, this is his house. It is the first Victorian home in Memphis, built in the 50s through a series of terrible conversations. The man who ran Memphis, E.H. Crump, who some calls Boss Crump, who I would never call him that, burned this house to the ground after stealing Robert Church's entire land mass from his son, selling it to the federal government to build the second ever public housing project on it, and literally sold the house to the fire department and stood outside on the front porch while he watched it burn to the ground. And that made me think about my great-great-great-great-grandparents. These are my great-grandma's grandparents, who were also born into slavery and died owning the land that they worked for someone else for free. And what I remembered, because I didn't realize I remembered that access to capital and access to land is a key in being able to be self-determined and self-actualized. And I also remembered that Black people in the South are innovators. And we've been building shit since the beginning, since our very first day. We may not be able to always protect our stuff, but we know how to build. That's never been our problem. And so these realizations made me understand, one, that I had to buy Clayborn Temple. So in 2019, we raised a whole bunch of money. It was super hard, and we bought the building to be able to return it back to this community who owns it in all their rights. And then we started raising money because we were like, well, other people should be able to buy stuff too, but there's no Black-led, female-led philanthropy investment in this entire region. And so we built, after we had the production company, because artistes, then we built the Big We Foundation. We've been raising a whole bunch of money. We helped buy the biggest land plot in the oldest Black neighborhood in the country. Right there, we helped them buy that. We're investing in these folks. We're about to have a farm called Big We Farms. But also, we get to do it in other places. We've been invited into this amazing, beautiful community in Mobile called Africatown. If you have not seen Descendant, please watch Descendant, because our future is about self-determination, self-actualization, and self-definition. In order to do that, we must be able to not just have access to capital, but to have control and agency over that capital. Folks in these communities have to be the ones to decide what happens, when it happens, where it happens, and with whom it happens. And that's all I have to say. I love y'all.
That was amazing. We're going to move these chairs up a little bit, and then we're going to all have a conversation. That's great. Come on up, friends. Can we have one more round of applause for this incredible group of storytellers? Come on up, come on up. Come on up.
Oh,
Hi, still here.
sorry.
Still here, still doing our thing. All right.
Okay.
Well, that was amazing. I'm going to move up a little bit. Can't see you. All right. So be thinking about your questions because I'm coming to you soon. But of course, I have a million. This was just incredible, y'all. And I love the threads between the four of you. They hadn't heard each other's talks before, and I feel like, I don't know if you heard it, but I heard so many threads that we could pull through here. Vivianne, I wanted to start with you. I wondered if you would speak to what I mentioned earlier about sort of the relationship between story and myth. One of the things you have been instrumental in, besides the incredible work around maternal mortality, is the COVID moment, and how do you get accurate stories out to people immediately versus mythology, which we saw rampant in every part of the world during that pandemic. How do you think about the relationship between story and myth?
I think, the two are similar but also very different in that a story are things you dream up and you imagine. And similarly, a myth is also things that you dream up and imagine. But myths are something that gets passed on. There's almost a mystical, spiritual angle to it. And people are often reluctant, especially when you talk about spiritual things, because people don't often want to question these assumptions. So if there's a spiritual belief, people are less likely to want to go against it because there's a fear of, if I counter that spiritual narrative that has been repeated often, I don't know what to happen. So there's a certain element of fear in it. With stories, you can almost interrogate the angle through which they came from. I mean, you alluded to COVID. I think in the instant of things like COVID, we quickly learned that something very powerful in the way people accept information or stories is, of course, from the lens they're looking at it, but also who is telling. So trust was a big element of it. And people don't often think about trust when you think of the mythology, because it's something that happened before. That spiritual element, you just accept it, because people have said it for many centuries or generations, and these stories, these myths just get passed on from one to the next, until somebody maybe someday counters it with an alternative proof or myth or story that people can now buy into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes so much sense. Yeah. It actually makes me think about the question I wanted to ask you, David, because you're making me think, Vivianne, about trusted messengers, like who does the storytelling is so critical. And one of the things that I feel like in our decade at Solutions Journalism Network we've really evolved to understand is that it's both about how is a story being approached, so solutions contextual to problems, but also who is the journalist that's telling that story? What is their trust in the community? What is their access to the community? How do they understand the history of that place, which Anasa just told so beautifully. And you've used the term narrative reparations, which I've found so compelling. Can you talk a little bit about how journalists like us, people in media, have a responsibility to be accountable to some of the stories we've told over the years that have been so damaging, and how you think about that kind of accountability?
Yeah, sure. And that's not my phrase, by the way. I heard it. I think, the journalism defines people. It doesn't allow people to tell their own stories very often. The journalist gets the byline for things that are actually co-authored. People help you put these things together. There's shared authorship in all journalism, but there's not shared power, and that's really ultimately what is the problem. But I think the main problem in journalism today, I think it's the sort of the number one problem, is that it tells journalism's quote-unquote theory of change, if it has one, is the world will get better when we show people how broken everything is. And so the journalists are they're always looking for germs to kill. Like literally there's a phrase, sunlight is the best disinfectant, that journalists use to sort of define their role. So you think of yourself as like disinfectant. So you're always looking for what's wrong. And so you're always looking for what's wrong with communities, what's wrong with people, what's wrong with families. And when you go to communities, people don't feel that there's a lot of things wrong with their family and there's a lot of things wrong with them. There's what are my aspirations? What are my assets? What are the capacities? What are the strengths we have? What are the solutions we're solving here? Why don't you ask about those things? Why aren't you even interested in them? I think of journalists as people who are like literally pushing antibodies out of their view because they're blocking their view of the germs. They're missing the strengths. And when we took our team to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, where EJI and Brian Stevenson's organization has sort of talked about the narrative of racial hierarchy that exists in the United States, which is how they sort of opened the museum. The artifacts were, a lot of them, half of them I think, were journalism. The narrative of racial hierarchy was created by journalism. It was authored by journalism. So that's where the idea of, I think, repairing that narrative comes from. The notion that it's not that you just have to stop telling stories that are stigmatizing, especially to communities of color, but you need to actually tell stories that show the agency, the capacity, the creativity everywhere. That's how I think people, when you talk about trust and respect, empathy, all of those things need to be fed on a regular basis through stories. And it just takes, I think it takes I think the main thing that journalism needs is tremendous humility, frankly.
And probably some folks have seen, but there are some local newspapers that have been actually publishing mea culpas where they say,
Yeah,
like,
big
we
apologies.
did this journalism in, the 1940s, 1950s. We want to, this is in, the American context.
Yeah.
And we want to own that and explain why we now understand how damaging that was. It's interesting to see some of that happening. Thank you. Rodney, you think so much about, I was thinking you must be loving what Anasa was talking about, because so much of your work is about shifting power and resources, and in very physical spaces, like helping communities understand all the assets that are there, the informal mayors, of places. And I was wondering if you would just reflect a little bit on, power, resources, and story. Like, how do you see story as related to the way in which power and resources can flow?
Yeah, thanks for that question, because I was actually assuming you were going to ask a different question, Courtney.
Oh,
I was
yeah?
going to say, I'm going to push back. But
I'm
actually,
like,
I
what
didn't
did
have
you
to do
think I was going to ask?
No.
I'm curious. Okay, go ahead.
No, actually, I think, so David, your comments just now, I think was perfect framing and what you said in terms of control and agency. So Courtney, I know you know this, I'm not sure if David does, but I started my career as a journalist. And it wasn't because...
Rodney is an incredible writer. You all should Google his name and read stuff he's written. Okay, go ahead.
No,
It's true.
so I started my career as a journalist, but it wasn't actually because of any particular, it wasn't like, hey, I wanted to grow up to become a journalist. But I had a knack for writing. And in retrospect, so I worked at alternative news weeklies, local papers that very few even exist any longer, unfortunately. And the thing that I'm thinking about to your question is, as I think about myself as a former journalist, I never had the language for solutions journalism. But every time I approached something, I always wanted to really bring forth what people were actually doing in communities, not highlighting just the problem.
Right.
Right. And I think some of that goes back to both power and lived experience. Again, I did not think about this actively, but because of my own life circumstances, growing up in West Baltimore, having very modest economic means coming up, I understood that there were people doing things that were actively trying to make change. Right? Again, not using that language, like not understanding it in that way. And so part of that I think about from the idea of journalism, one specifically is, to David's point, it's who is the journalist? Who can be a journalist? Right? I was not a trained journalist. I was someone who wanted to share, tell true stories, right? And by doing that and having that mindset, it was, again, not thinking about it in this way, Courtney, that I was sharing something, like sharing power, sharing resources.
Yeah.
But that's what I was
You're saying this
actively
is what
doing.
I see.
Right, this is what I see. How do we elevate and ensure that these individuals, these communities are being viewed in the ways they ought to be viewed, right? As assets for themselves, right? And using those stories that I was writing as a journalist to really be a pathway for that. Now, to a more broader point of this in terms of stories and how that plays a role in power, right? I think, Anasa, your point, and this is a thing, the work that we do at Common Future, there's a lot of conversation about access to capital, right? But what you're talking about, control and agency, that's the piece that we need to move forward on. But that's not the narrative, that's not the story we tell.
Yeah.
Right? And when I say we, the collective we, not a big we or, or the folks on the stage. But that's actually a big piece of, that's a very tangible piece of that. When we even say things like access to capital, people design programs and institutions accordingly to that.
Right.
Which is very different than building programs and institutions and policies that are really about agency and control.
Yeah.
Very different approaches.
Right.
And so how are we telling those types of stories to elevate what that means? Like obviously what Anasa shared earlier or just a moment ago. That's a profoundly different approach. And that's the opportunity that we have with storytelling.
Yeah.
And again, as I shared in my remarks, there's the other side of it and how stories are used actively to dismiss.
Yeah. I'm like imagining this matrix in my head actually of like, we were at exclusion in both journalism and in capital, like people of color are excluded and other kinds of people were excluded. Then we're saying, like, let's have a dignifying inclusion, access to capital or access to being portrayed in a way that is not, like, feels inaccurate and feels like it only focuses on negativity. And what we're really saying is, no, we want to, like, change the whole paradigm. So it's not about getting access to a system that's broken to begin with, whether it's journalism or capital. It's like getting different people in power to decide what is journalism and where should capital go and how should it be distributed, right? So I feel like we're on a radical trajectory. We're heading there. Anasa, I cannot help but ask you this. I have so many like systemic structural questions for you, but I am obsessed with the moment that you walk into the church you were describing, that you just were like, I'm going to walk in. What stories or story were you told, and by who, that allowed you to feel that agency at that moment?
My mom. I was like over there trying not to weep during your story, Rodney, because I grew up the same way. The things that Rodney was learned in those 2 years is really the culture in my house. Is my parents were like, you're amazing because you're black. You're amazing because you're going to be a woman one day. And my mother literally said to me, you can do anything you want. And I believed her. And so when someone told me to walk through the door, and I'm like, I want to do that, I'm going to walk through the door. And know that when I get to the other side, no matter who is there and what their welcoming or lack thereof is, that I can belong if I decide. And that grounding and that like culture that I was nurtured in and that I carry with me is the reason why I do all the things I do. Literally, I thrive doing things that I don't know how to do. Because if I see something and I'm like, I want that thing, or I want to know how to do that, or I want to, like, I started a record label, I'm now a historic preservation developer, I'm raising millions of dollars to give away to the black people. Like, I don't know how to do any of that, but but I approach it with the mind.
Give her all your money.
All of it.
Just give her all of it.
But I approach everything through the lens of a producer, because that was my first job, was as a producer. When I was 19, I was producing, right? When I was 23, I started a record label. So I don't have to know how to write a song. I know how to find the best songwriter. I don't have to know how to restore a historic space. I need to find the best historic preservation architect and the best construction team. I know how to impart vision, I know how to build a team, and I know how to build community. And if you can do those things, anything, and you have to believe you belong, right? If you have that, you literally can do anything. Like, I don't believe there's anything I can't do if I have the right team and I have the right support and I have the right belief in myself. So when I walked in the building, I was like, this is my building to walk into.
About you, that is so beautiful. What's your mom's name?
Her name is Rusty Fuller.
Rusty Fuller. I feel like names are so important, so I like to actually honor someone with their name. It's making me think, for those of us in the audience, there's an interesting juxtaposition between the humility that David is talking about and the chutzpah, or the kind of like boldness you're talking about. And so for each of us to think about, like, what stories did I grow up with that either over-developed my muscle for thinking I know about communities that I don't actually know enough about? And what were the stories that those of us were fed that taught us we shouldn't walk into the church, whatever your proverbial church is? And how do we rebalance that, right? How does a journalist like me have more humility about what I do or don't know about a community? And how do others who need more of this boldness, more of this, like, just walking into the church, get that? So we're going to go to the audience now. There's so many brilliant people in this audience. I know many of you. So in honor of the brilliance in the audience, I'm going to ask you to actually ask a question if you get the mic, because we want to get as many questions as we can. So don't give me like a 7-minute talk. Be like, and now my talk will happen for 7 minutes, and then I'll pretend I have a question. Please just ask a question so we can get as many as possible. I see one in the middle. I think we have a roving mic here. Thank you, Connor. And let us know what your name is and where you're coming from. That would be great.
Hi, my name is Jacka Blay. I'm coming from Vancouver, Canada. I'm on the board for Philanthropic Foundations Canada. My question is what you've seen that works, or the importance of shifting the narrative from a mindset of scarcity to abundance.
I think we know who would like to take this one first. Yes, go for it.
I would just like to point out that I'm wearing a necklace that says abundance around my neck. And that abundance is basically the closest thing I have to a religion. Because in my mind, if you listen to the dominant narrative, we're not supposed to have anything at all. And particularly a black woman who lives in the South, in the States, I'm not supposed to have anything. And I also feel like so much of what we deal with in the world that we are all working against is about scarcity. And it's about the fact that people feel like there is so little that you have to be just the worst person on earth to everyone to keep what you have. And the truth is that there is more than enough for everyone. There's more than enough. And the truth is that our divine source is where all of our things come from, right? And that we have access to literally anything we want if we can manifest it. And there are complications and political things and other things that I know are wrapped up in there that we can talk about and deconstruct later. But like, I have all that I have because I have an abundance practice. I'm able to raise money for other people because I have an abundance practice, and I deeply believe that it is my birthright to access all of the riches of this planet and this whole galaxy for the good of all. And that's how I make my life work.
Woo! I love that. Should we just let that stand and take the next one, I think? It's hard to trump that. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Anjali. I'm from Bangladesh. And you all are such gifted storytellers. I was just reflecting back on what Maria said yesterday, that lies spread many times faster than truth in this world. So my question to the panel is, what needs to shift and where, so that the stories of hope, all the stories that you are telling right now, those stories can spread faster than stories of despair?
David, I bet you have some ideas with this, yeah.
Maria also said that inspiration spreads almost as, I don't know if it's almost or
She said
as fast as anger. So, and, you know, so you think, you know, if you want people to be inspired to make art, you show them beautiful art. If you want people to be inspired to play a game, you show them, you know, the Olympics or something. So I think, you know, if you want people to feel inspired about possibilities in the world, which spreads quickly, you show them beautiful social change. And you give them exposures on a regular basis of actual possibilities, like real, not one day Xanadu will be built kind of possibilities, but beauty in the world that is actually happening right now, importance, kindness, compassion, love with power, and make that the story that you tell. And I believe very strongly that the appetite for misinformation and the appetite, the conflict entrepreneurs who monetize rage and monetize resentment are able to do that because of the hope deficit or the love deficit. So I would say feed that, you know, and the appetite for the other stuff will drop.
Who's that? Yes, thank you. We go right here. Oh, right here. Yeah.
I agree with David. I think that as much as you are in a situation that everything you think is like falling apart, and no matter what is it, like life is everywhere around you, it's just like closing. But if you have the spirituality that you are talking about, and also communicating that inspiration and love and wisdom and closeness, it's really carry you and also carry the people who are around you, and they get inspired by your wisdom and love, and it's keep them going on. So that's, I wanted to share that. I face this every day with my people around me, that they have faith in me and I have faith on them, and so together we make it everyday life to keep going. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see over here. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Dr. Mandeep Rai, the author of The Values Compass, and my question will be about values. I hear the word abundance and love. Are there any values, or one value perhaps, that you think has opened the doors so that you can keep on going and dreaming as big as you have dreamt?
Love.
Thank you.
Yeah, you can all
Every time.
answer that probably quickly.
Mine is love every time. People used to call me the love lady because I just be talking about love all the time. And I'm like, what else is there?
For me, I'd say one thing that always resonates with people and is easy to tell is come with your authentic self and show up as you mean to continue. So whoever you are, let people see it in the way you live your life. That authenticity, I think, inspires people to do things differently. And just very quickly, I say this because, I mean, I live in Nigeria, and one issue people always talk about is how do we inspire leadership? How do we inspire leaders? And that comes from people actually seeing that there is a way to do things that can inspire people to think differently, to do things the right way. So if you say you're going to do one particular thing, do it. And when people say it, that inspires them to also know that there's different ways of doing things. So leadership and be authentic, I think, are very important. And that has to be hinged on what you were talking about. What are your values also? Yeah.
Rodney, anything?
I think for me, it's maybe a sense of obligation and respect. Because I think, for me, I think about, and so much that what you shared, there's a long line of folks who were able to set me up for success, right? And I think it's about how do you contribute back to that? And how do you contribute and continuously have that kind of perpetual cycle going? I guess yesterday we would have called that community in the conversation we had. I did want to say one thing that's not connected to that question, but is maybe a little connecting piece from the prior two. Scarcity and abundance, I love the framing. And I love an inspiration and how there is indication that like inspiring stories move quickly as well. I do think that like from another perspective though, it's acknowledging that some of the most vocal, why people will resonate with, why some of the misinformation resonates for some folks is because, or so many, is a fear of losing something they believe they have. And it goes back to power.
That's right.
And other and so I just, you know, how to connect those two and be really clear about that, that there is a sense of something, someone's coming after something I have. Someone that's not a part of my circle is coming for something. And that's a different framing than scarcity and abundance, right? It's a little bit different. And it's slightly different than inspiration as well, right? Because some of the things that we've been talking about the last few days, the backlash to what we're putting forth, like the folks in this room are putting forth and those watching, there's something that folks feel is being taken away, right? And I just how to...
Absolutely. I think that's the thing that I love about abundance is that abundance for a few people is actually not abundance. That's still scarcity. Abundance means that we all have everything that we need, and there's even more. That's the thing that makes me so happy about it, is because it really does mean enough for everyone. You don't lose anything.
I also hear you speaking, Rodney, to something that I notice in spaces like this, which is that we are, you know, I co-founded a thing called Solutions Journalism Network. Obviously, I love solutions, but the only way to dignify people's true experiences when we write about solutions is to also honor their real pain and to say that all of these things always go hand in hand. It's not that we're saying write about solutions and don't write about problems, contemporary or historical, apropos of like one of the hottest topics of these moments is like, how do we talk about history, the beautiful film that you talked about last night. So it's like, and that's where we get into the toxic positivity, which I was so proud of Al Gore for saying, that like, how do we balance? Like we were talking about solutions and we are moving towards inspiration and we really need to acknowledge people's pain and we really need to acknowledge our history and, you know, global history, I'm thinking in the US context, but so that those things are not separate conversations. I think those things always have to be contextualized.
Yeah. And can I add something to the values? I feel like, and this is in Anasa, this is, I think, captured, I don't know what the value would be in the big we, which is, like I think of, and Rodney and I have a friend, Sarah Heminger, who speaks beautifully about this, that the true wealth in life is relationships. Is it not feeling that, the separation from another person, whether it's their pain or their joy. You know, if we are in relationship, if we are connected, there is abundance. Scarcity is really a story of separation at its core. And I think, you know, for me as a journalist, like the byline is a very separating idea. It's like, oh, I'm the person who wrote that. I mean, the whole things that reinforce you, the person on stage, the one who gets to talk, the one who has the wealth, and all those separating I narratives create scarcity narratives. They feed it, and they feed the need for, it's like they feed people who need to drink more of it because they're drinking salt water. No matter how much they drink, they can't ever quench the thirst.
Little David preaching. Okay. Mara, is it right there? Yeah. Can someone get her a mic, please? Yeah, well, we're online, so we need you to mic, if you don't mind.
Thank you. One thing I'm thinking a lot about is understanding the power of humans, the human story, right, and centering the human story, and how, as a consumer of that story, right, you can read, you can empathize, you can be really moved. But we, as movements, right, are trying to also move people to action.
Right.
So I'm trying to think of like the link between, it's like someone, you know, hearing the story, listening to story, and then moving them to action, because that's where I feel like we lose so much of the potential.
Yeah, what a great question. I think this is so important. Does anyone?
Yeah.
Yes, Vivianne, go for it.
I think part of, you know, the story I told about the community we went to spoke to the power of storytelling. And those stories are important because it takes you beyond just statistics. Numbers don't tell you a story. But by understanding stories, how do you now get that attention and empathy? But beyond the empathy, how do you now use that to influence change? Because those stories bring to life the issue you're talking about. And you use those stories to hold politicians, decision makers accountable to deliver on those things that the story is telling you. Because people don't often think, I mean, in the context I told it, people don't often think about mothers as these very important people in communities who need to be valued. And by understanding those stories, then that takes you beyond just the numbers and also feeds into that empathy that you can identify with. Because anybody, whoever you are, has a mother, has a sister, has a daughter. And that's why the power of stories, we hope, will kind of change that narrative and elevate those stories to a platform where the decision makers often, let me be honest, patriarchal society I'm from, people don't think about them enough. So that's the power of the storytelling.
Yes, of course.
The reason why I do what I do is because I saw a vast chasm between people who were telling amazingly transformative stories and did not have any way to engage folks around those stories, and people who were engaged in community and were terrible at telling stories. And so there has to be connective tissue between the storytellers and the organizers and the investors and the funders, because if you don't, you'll like make people feel really good, and then they'll go home and wake up the next day and be like, what a great story. Or you'll have people who are completely uninspired, who are ready to work, ready to invest, and are like reading white papers. Like, no shade against your white paper, but like it's not gonna move people, right? And so we, at the Big We have a culture shift model that we call Culture Shift 101 that's about transformative storytelling and shared cultural experience, but also about engagement, also about embodiment, how you are embodying those stories in your work and how you're asking people to embody it out in the world, and the use of technology to go to scale. And it all comes back to a conversation about values. Because if you want to move people, you have to start with the core value you want to infuse and embed in their life, and then help them, work with them to be able to figure out what that looks like in a manifested way. So like it's complex. We're dealing with the most complex issues in human history. And we have to have complex ecosystems of action to be able to address and move past those things. But it all starts with narrative. You cannot have a culture shift without a narrative shift. You cannot do it. So like this is, the storytelling is the fun part and the important part and the inspiring part.
Love it. So, stories are not an end, they are a beginning, right? That for all of us to notice our own catharsis when we hear a story and then think, wait, what am I doing about this? Especially in our local context, right? Each of us can go back and say, like, if I have this value, if I care about this thing, what am I actually doing with my life, with my money, with my children, to make sure that I am part of an actual shift of power and resources, right? So all of us can go home thinking about that. I just feel
Can
so...
I add one thought? One
very
really,
quickly, 'cause
really
I'm getting the...
simple rubric is, like, 2 questions that people have to answer yes to, I think, to be moved to action are very simple. Can I do it, and is it worth it? And those 2 questions, you can think really systematically about, are you addressing those questions?
Can I do it? Is it worth it? This was worth it. This was incredible. Please follow these people on their various social media platforms and fund them, and go to their shows and Google Rodney's articles and just support these incredible humans. I just feel so grateful to every single one of you for what you shared today, and thank you to the audience. Thank you so much.